your work.
Thank you so much for staying on. I trust we all remember the time when the internet first impacted our lives. To me, my first eBay purchase is very memorable, as I immediately resold it, a sheet of misprinted postage stamps, at a profit which paid for a round-the-world trip for my entire family. I also remember the time savings when I was doing research and found obscure information in seconds, which previously would have taken literally weeks to locate, involving trips abroad, etc. But even that is an understatement of the impact, for I would often not even have known where to start looking. So the internet instantly provides answers not just to the unknowns, but even, to use the famous quote from Donald Rumsfeld, to unknown unknowns. So what we are going through is no doubt a paradigm change, a drastic continuity and shift in perspective. But our biggest challenge is that this shift is happening more or less simultaneously with a more profound paradigm shift, the looming limits to planetary growth, to resources, the growing climate instability. And the digital future will need to respond to this shift and these challenges if it is to have an impact and be relevant to our shared future. The USA used to be known in Germany as the land of unlimited possibilities. Terms like cyberspace suggest a similar absence of limits. But just like in the USA, the limits soon became and will become apparent. At a BT conference a few years ago, I learned that an avatar in the then popular TV game Second Life consumed as much energy as the average inhabitant of Costa Rica. What resources and what energies will be needed to implement what has been proposed here? There are, of course, renewable energy sources, but they're often costlier because they are not subsidized as much. But there are often no alternatives to the scarce and rare raw materials required to construct the hardware for the digital revolution, the devices which make it possible, and are often designed, as we know, for quick obsolescence. We heard yesterday about the 1.5 billion devices sold last year. How many were thrown away last year? There are solutions like the cradle-to-cradle design principles developed by Professor Michael Braungart in Germany and William Dunno in the United States, which could make smartphones, etc., much easier to dismantle and thus to recondition and recycle and not downcycle. These need to be legally mandated, but would again increase prices previously externalized, which have then become internalized. And limits are not just physical, but also moral. The campaign against African so-called blood diamonds forced the diamond trade to undertake costly reforms. It's likely that a similar campaign against blood smartphones will soon follow, unless the industry takes measures to control the sources, for example, of the coltan it buys from civil war-torn Congo. But while regulation within the current paradigms can solve such problems, the real challenge goes deeper. Most of the inventions we hear about here are meant to facilitate and are based on increasing consumerism. This will not be possible in many areas. Chandra Nair, who runs the Global Institute for Tomorrow in Hong Kong, writes in his book, Consumptionomics, there just aren't enough resources to facilitate, to enable the per capita resource consumption in many areas of Germany, in China. It will just never happen. It isn't physically possible. Not even the per capita consumption, resource consumption in Taiwan can ever happen in China. We need to find different models of growth. And of course, growth is not always a problem. As the second report to the Club of Rome, much less well known than the first one, The Limits to Growth, second report was entitled, There Are No Limits to Learning. Online language courses, music downloads can grow with minimal costs. Although, of course, I wonder about the economic sustainability of business models in which losses and the number of paying subscribers seem to increase at the same time. And we should be a bit careful about pronouncing we're not in a bubble, because bubbles like paradigm shifts are rarely spotted in advance. The World Future Council, which I founded 7 years ago, works with policymakers worldwide to identify policies and regulations which can provide the best incentives to put us back on a sustainable track, to ensure that our solutions grow faster than our problems. We have a global, diverse membership from business, civil society, the arts, the sciences and politics, and we work at the interface between policy research and policy implementation, which is very interesting. Many policymakers find that policy research is too academic for them. They need the information, they need the capacity, they need the information, but they don't get it. And of course, if they want to do something, they are blocked by civil servants, by lobbyists, by governments who are naturally conservative. And the best counter-argument, of course, is, but it's already being done in another country. So we look wherever possible for a law or regulation which already exists in another country. And then, when we have the resources, we spread it. So there's a regional Brazilian law on food security, which has reduced child mortality in Belo Horizonte by 75%. Since it was introduced at the cost of about 2% of the city budget. So we're now working to take that law to adapt it to African needs, first of all, to install it in Namibia. The key policies we have summarized, and I'm sure that you may well have additional proposals, because the area you're working in has not been so far one of our major areas of expertise. These policies we have started assembling are gathered in the Global Policy Action Plan, which is a tool for decision makers, and you can find it on futurepolicy.org. There are many conferences today on why change is needed and what the goal should be, massive conferences like that. But we work on the more difficult part, how we can actually get there. For example, almost everyone agrees that subsidies on fossil fuels are bad and should be abolished, but ignore the enormous practical and political difficulties of doing so. As one example, when petrol subsidies were abolished in Jordan for financial reasons, the income of Jordanian taxi drivers fell by 2/3. So, of course, as you can imagine, there were massive protests. Similar things happened in Sudan and Nigeria last year. So we all have responsibilities as citizens, not just rights as entrepreneurs and consumers. And we need to take these responsibilities seriously. That's not a popular message. UNESCO tried at the beginning of the millennium to draft and develop a declaration of human duties and responsibilities, matching every proclaimed human right with a moral duty and legal responsibility for every sector in society. You can find it under Valencia Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, because the meetings were held in Valencia. But it got nowhere because major governments were not happy. They tell us that economic growth will soon take off again, and with the help of that and new technologies, our problems will be solved. Indeed, they have nothing to offer apart from this rather naive hope in a return to the pre-2008 world. But this belief is increasingly disconnected from the real world. In a ruined or heavily damaged natural environment, there can be no growth, no markets, no democracy, no human rights, and no technological progress. We don't know how to redesign our natural world. The famous high-tech and extremely well-funded Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona tried and failed conspicuously. All our achievements, our plans, and our hopes depend on sustainable ecosystems, enabling life on Earth to flourish. Melting glaciers and spreading deserts do not negotiate. Nature provides no bailout packages. But our governments are still advised by economists who do not understand such basic ecological realities. They believe that our natural environment is a dependent subsystem of the human economy. It's a quote from a publication by Lawrence Summers, who was, had some of the most powerful positions you can imagine as an economist. They believe that climate change will only seriously affect agriculture, which in the USA represents only 3% of GDP. Thus, even a 50% fall in production would only slow down GDP growth by about 1.5%, which they say could easily be compensated for in other areas. Thus, as long as we produce enough smartphones, it doesn't matter that food production is collapsing. Again, a quote, among others, from Thomas Schelling, who won the so-called Nobel Prize in economics. When it comes to climate change and other environmental threats, we have a problem because the media are actually usually less alarmist and less informative than the relevant experts who are really getting scared. You may ask why? Well, the logical answer is clear. Media is dependent on corporate advertising, and those corporations who are part of the problem have more money than those who want to be part of the solution. We now all face a unique responsibility vis-à-vis future generations of life on Earth. And unless we change course quickly, our children will already inherit a planet of major conflicts over resources and hundreds of millions of climate refugees in Europe. That, again, is not some alarmist statement. It's recently a statement from Michel Camdessus, the former head of the IMF, after he'd taken a long trip to relevant African countries. So again, this is not scaremongering. Such predictions are also based on reports from the Pentagon and British government Defense Department think tanks. Globalization, of course, has enabled us to postpone the discussion of limits by growing into the economic and ecological space of other countries, ensuring that when limits actually do hit, they will be global and simultaneous. This forces us to rethink and, where necessary, change every institution, every agreement, every law. Why is this so hard to understand, to accept, and to do? Well, for many years, professional futurists have found a strong disconnect between people's often very pessimistic views about the future of the planet and their countries, and their very optimistic views about their own personal futures. This is, of course, understandable, but it has now reached levels of denial which are no longer sustainable. We are continuing to accumulate debt, not just financial, but debts against the environment, debts against future generations, claims on future wealth, much faster than we are producing such wealth. And clearly, this cannot continue. A sustainable energy supply is now a human and environmental security issue which cannot be subjected to the rules of the market. A World Future Council study last year found that the cost of the non-use of renewable energies amounts to over $3 trillion per annum in wasted natural capital. The solar, wind, etc. energy potential we don't use every day is lost forever. Instead, we burn valuable fossil fuel raw materials, and therefore direct cost comparisons between renewables and non-renewables are basically bad accounting. Chandra Nair, who founded, I've already mentioned, says that the most urgent need now is not for new technical model inventions, but new accounting models to internalize such costs. But they've been externalized so long, that on such a scale, massive scale, at the expense of our environment and the future, that such reforms will be extremely challenging. Our Councillor Pavan Sukhdev, who was seconded by Deutsche Bank to UNEP to study the cost of biodiversity destruction, writes in his latest book, Corporation 2020, that most corporations in the world would be bankrupt if they were forced to internalize the full cost of their production. But of course, not doing so is unfair competition, even fraudulent. But the necessary transition will be an enormous challenge requiring detailed strategies and a new legal framework for corporations and markets. Our whole economic planning is based on discounting the future because of the assumption that we'll be richer then. But if we are poorer, as many now fear, future discount rates will need to be negative. Again, a major challenge. Value-added taxes should probably be replaced by value-depleted taxes. Today, no political leader would dare to proclaim a goal of 1 to 1.5% GDP growth annually, but such a growth rate would still expand the economy by a third to one-half in one generation. The German Empire was industrialized with such growth rates. CEOs in the extractive industries now confirm that the resources to support, for example, global 3% growth are not being found at the rates which would make this possible. And of course, there can be no human right to something which isn't possible. Asked about how a sustainable future would look, Chandra Nair recently said, fewer car races and more dancing competitions. An interesting comment. In the USA, this earned him the accusation of being an environmental Taliban. So, while our future will still be shared as we live on the same planet, there is no reason why it should be common, i.e. the same. On the contrary, I think we should aim to expand our choice of futures rather than reducing them. This also requires future generations having some representation, some say when decisions affecting them are made, which is why one thing we're working on is this institutional representation of future generations at the UN level, at national levels, like creating a parliamentary ombudsman for future generations. So I will cut it, okay. I think there is the end of the belief in the power of market prices to solve our planetary, challenges may not even go far enough. There is another deeper challenging paradigm shift, which I think is directly relevant to what we're talking about here. The change, there's a change of perspective about the future of technology, which is appearing in the nation, which was a pioneer in adopting and embracing new technologies. Many young Japanese today are becoming distrustful of technologies in a broad sense, as they are often associated with falseness and futility. Having developed unimaginably complex virtual worlds, they find themselves in a situation where dreaming about the future is no longer appealing to them because it can be visualized, packaged, and sold in a matter of seconds. Many are astonishingly anti-consumist and frustrated with the values of progress, preferring to seek inner enlightenment. This is, of course, not an isolated example. The pilgrim path to Santiago, etc., Santiago de Compostela, which was deserted 20 years ago, is already packed. Many young want to be captains of their soul instead of being ruled by economic benefits, cost-benefit analysis. So these changes are perhaps not surprising, but they remind us again that the future is not predetermined. It can be very costly to assume that it is. Nuclear power was supposed to play a major key role in Germany's energy future. One accident in Japan put an end to that. And I think the DLD community, I hope, will have learned from the 2000 bubble not to assume that trends are irreversible. Print media advertising may have fallen, but is it really realistic to predict, as we saw in one graph yesterday, that it will be zero in a few years' time, implying an end to centuries of print media? All entrepreneurship needs a social license to operate. As Mr. Höttges from Deutsche Telekom said on Sunday, the most powerful customer is the regulator. You want me to? Okay, 1 minute, yeah? Yeah, okay. Yesterday we are told that the dark net cannot be regulated. This complacency will end as soon as it is found that a terrorist attack was planned there. The public will not accept that rules in the real world should not apply in the online world, and you need to engage with policymakers to ensure this is done in the ways which do not block genuine progress. And we from the World Future Council are happy to work with you on that. I suggest digital life design needs to become both less and more humble. Less humble in the sense that it needs to speak out and inform and work on answers to the threats facing our shared future, prioritizing building informed global citizenship over promoting unsustainable global consumerism. And it needs to become more humble by shedding its claim to determine our future and see itself as a tool to enhance rather than replace our offline lives. Otherwise, it might find the young in other countries following the Japanese example. Even if our lives can be fully digitalized, we still have 24 hours a day. What will people give up offline to spend more time online? And does it make sense to encourage that, reducing physical exercise and human interaction? Cars have to prove their roadworthiness before they're allowed on the roads. Should not online intervention have to prove their social and usefulness before being licensed to operate? Do we understand the consequences of educating children as extensions of digital devices, increasingly unable to function without them? In his report on the African Spring, the CEO of Google recognizes while the revolution there was facilitated by the social media, they were not responsible. He says, if you need to occupy the Ministry of the Interior, you cannot use your phone. You actually have to go there yourself. There's no guarantee of human progress. When the Roman Empire fell, much technological and other knowledge was lost for centuries in Central Europe, being preserved only in the Celtic fringe monasteries of Northern Europe. Today there is no Celtic fringe to call on if we get it wrong. So, to quote Winston Churchill, it will not be enough to do our best. We will have to do what is necessary. Thank you very much.